Welcome to Stories from the Front. Take a second to like, subscribe, and activate notifications. In the waters of the Pacific, I wrote my name in history without knowing it. I'm William Bill Turner, former pilot of the USS Enterprise, and at 98, I can still feel the sway of the aircraft carrier beneath my feet when I think back to the Battle of Midway in 1942. Every takeoff and return of those June days remains as clear as the horizon on a clear day. The morning of June 4th, 1942 remains as vivid in my memory as if it were yesterday. I had turned 24 just 2 weeks earlier, and like many young pilots, I carried a mixture of youthful confidence and constant apprehension. That morning's briefing was straightforward. Our intelligence had detected a massive Japanese task force approaching Midway. 4 enemy aircraft carriers, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, were on their way. Our SBD, Dauntless Bomber Squadron, was ready to take off at the first sign. The weight of responsibility was immense, but at that moment, it was as if every hour of training, every drill, every exercise had prepared us for this particular moment. My navigator Frank Morrison checked and rechecked our instruments with the methodical precision that characterized him. The Enterprise's takeoff was perfect despite the challenging conditions. The sky was partly cloudy, which would make our mission even more complex. We were flying in formation with other units, including squadrons of Yorktowns and Hornets. Radio silence was broken only by essential communications, each pilot absorbed in his own thoughts and prayers. After 2 hours of searching, we spotted the first indication of the Japanese fleet. Clouds of smoke on the horizon indicated their position. My heart raced when I spotted the first enemy aircraft carrier, the Kaga. It was an impressive sight, but there was no time for admiration. Our approach had to be precise. Our tactics were risky, but necessary. We dived at an almost vertical angle of maneuver that made us more difficult targets for anti-aircraft artillery, but which required nerves of steel and perfect timing. The roar of the wind against the fuselage of the Dauntless was deafening, mixing with the sound of the explosions around us. Morrison remained calm, providing crucial data, while I concentrated on staying on course. The Japanese anti-aircraft defense was intense, creating a curtain of fire that seemed impossible to break through. Projectiles passed dangerously close, leaving trails in the air that seemed to weave a deadly web. The timing of the launch demanded absolute precision. At an altitude of 2,000 feet, we released our 1,000-pound bomb. The impact was directly on the deck of the Kaga. The explosion that followed confirmed that we had hit an ammunition or fuel depot. In a matter of minutes, the proud aircraft carrier was engulfed in flames. But our mission was far from over. Other squadrons were simultaneously attacking the other Japanese aircraft carriers. The sky was covered with American and Japanese planes, anti-aircraft tracers, and black smoke from the stricken ships. It was a terrible spectacle and magnificent at the same time. During our ascent, after the attack, we witnessed the result of our combined efforts. The Akagi, another Japanese aircraft carrier, had also been hit. The coordination between our units was working perfectly, something we had practiced exhaustively, but which rarely materialized with such precision in real combat conditions. The return to the Enterprise was tense. Our fuel was low, and several planes had combat damage. Morrison kept a constant eye on our instruments, calculating our range. The relief at seeing our carrier was indescribable, but we still had to make a precise landing on a moving deck. That first attack was just the start of a day that would change the course of the war in the Pacific forever. In a matter of hours, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, and Hiri, would be destroyed, a loss from which the Imperial Navy would never fully recover. The victory at Midway was not just the result of courage or skill, but a combination of intelligence, preparation, and yes, a little luck. Every man who took part in that battle carries with him memories that time cannot erase, moments of terror and triumph that defined not only our individual lives but the fate of nations. The events that followed after our first successful attack on Kaga will remain forever etched in my memory. As we returned to the Enterprise for refueling, we had no idea that we were about to take part in what would be known as the most decisive 5 minutes in American naval history. During the landing on the Enterprise, I noticed that Morrison was unusually silent. Only later did he confess to me that he had been grazed by a piece of shrapnel during our final run. Even though he was injured, he continued to provide crucial data throughout the mission. That was the kind of dedication that characterized our men. We didn't have much time for rest. While the ground teams refueled our Dauntless and checked the damage, we received the updated coordinates of the other Japanese aircraft carriers. The Hiryu had changed its position, attempting a desperate counterattack. Our next mission was to stop it. On deck, I bumped into Jimmy Watson, a rookie pilot who had only arrived 3 weeks earlier. His eyes shone with a mixture of fear and determination. "What's it like up there, sir?" he asked. I replied with the truth I'd learned in months of combat. "It's like hell, son, but we're the ones who control the flames." Our second takeoff was even more tense than the first. The weather had worsened, and low clouds made visibility difficult. We flew in tighter formation, now each pilot aware that our coordination could be the difference between victory and defeat. It was during this second mission that I witnessed something extraordinary. Our squadron was approaching Hiryu when we spotted a group of Japanese Zeros returning to refuel. It was a unique opportunity. The enemy fighters were low on fuel and wouldn't be able to pursue us for long. Morrison spotted an opening in the Hiryu's anti-aircraft defense. 3 degrees to port, Bill, he muttered over the intercom. "We got a window." I started the dive, feeling the Dauntless vibrate under the pressure. The maneuver we were executing was even riskier than the previous one, but we knew that every second was precious. The coordinated attack was devastating. 3 squadrons converging simultaneously, each aiming at different points on the carrier. I saw 2 bombs hit the flight deck, followed by an explosion that lit up the sky like a new dawn. The Hiryu proud flagship was beginning to succumb. Between the fragmented radio transmissions, I heard Jimmy Watson's voice. He had made his first direct hit. His joy was contagious, even in the midst of chaos. But war has a cruel way of balancing victories with losses. Minutes later, his Dauntless was hit. His last transmission was a simple, "It was worth it, gentlemen." The return to the Enterprise after the second mission was marked by a different kind of silence. It was no longer the tension of anticipation, but the weight of reality. We had lost good men, but we had also changed the course of the war. In less than a day, the Japanese Navy had lost 4 of its best aircraft carriers. In the briefing room, the reports started coming in. The Soryu and Akagi had also been destroyed by other squadrons. Our strategy of coordinated attacks had worked beyond the most optimistic expectations. Japanese naval superiority in the Pacific had been broken in a matter of hours. Morrison, still recovering from his wound, made a comment that sums up that day perfectly. "You know, Bill, today we didn't just win a battle. We showed that they're not invincible." He was right. Midway wasn't just a military victory, it was a psychological turning point. That night, in the Enterprise mess hall, the atmosphere was a peculiar mix of restrained celebration and respectful mourning. We celebrated our victory, but we also honored those who had paid the ultimate price for it. Commander Johnson raised a silent toast. Words were unnecessary. As he watched the sunset on that historic day, he reflected on how small decisions and moments of individual courage added up to create something much greater. Every pilot, every navigator, every man on board had contributed to a victory that would change the course of the war in the Pacific. The morning after our historic victory, the reality of what we had achieved began to set in. The morning briefing revealed the full extent of our actions: 4 Japanese aircraft carriers destroyed in a single day. But the human cost was also becoming clear. We lost 147 brave men in that battle. Morrison was still in the infirmary, recovering from his wound. I visited him before our next mission. "Don't think you're going to get rid of me so easily, Bill," he joked, even in obvious pain. His resilience was inspiring, a common trait among our men. Our new mission was to locate and neutralize the Japanese support ships that had survived. Intelligence indicated that several destroyers were trying to rescue survivors from the sunken aircraft carriers. It was a grim reminder that even in war, humanity still existed on both sides. I took off with a new navigator, Robert Hayes, a veteran transferred from the Yorktown. The sky was clearer that day, offering perfect visibility, a blessing and a curse. We could see our targets clearly, but we would also be easily spotted. During the flight, Hayes shared his experience on the Yorktown, which had been severely damaged the day before. "That ship is special," he said, "but what we did yesterday, Turner, that's going to change everything." He was right. We could already feel the change in the atmosphere, in the morale of the troops. We located a group of Japanese destroyers approximately 50 miles northeast of the last known position of the sunken aircraft carriers. The sea was covered in oil slicks and debris of floating graveyards stretching as far as the eye could see. Our attack on the destroyers was different. There wasn't the same frantic urgency as the day before, but a calculated precision. We executed more conservative diving maneuvers, aiming to incapacitate the ships without necessarily sinking them. It was a different form of combat requiring both skill and restraint. During one of these runs, I saw something I'll never forget: Japanese sailors rescuing their compatriots from the water. For a moment, the war seemed to pause. That scene humanized our enemy in a way I hadn't expected. I diverted our attack to another target, a decision that Hayes silently supported. Back on the Enterprise, I ran into Commander Harrison, who had led one of the squadrons the day before. "Turner," he said, "some victories weigh more than others." His words carried the weight of experience. We had won a crucial battle, but each of us would forever carry the memories of those 2 days. Stories began to circulate among the crews. Tales of extraordinary heroism, of silent sacrifices, of small miracles in the midst of chaos. One Hornet pilot managed to land his damaged plane using only basic instruments. Another saved his injured navigator, keeping the plane stable while applying first aid. Young Jimmy Watson was posthumously decorated. His last act of bravery had allowed 3 other planes to complete their attacks successfully. His family would receive the medal, but we who flew with him would carry his memory. At night on the deck of the Enterprise, I watched the stars with other pilots. The ocean was calm, almost respectfully silent. We talked about the future, about how Midway had changed the course of the war. But we also talked about our fears, our hopes, our families at home. Morrison was discharged from the infirmary 3 days later. His first question was when we could fly together again. "As soon as you can get on that plane without making faces," I replied. We laughed, but we both knew that the war was far from over. The Battle of Midway taught us a lot about strategy, about courage, about the power of precise intelligence and teamwork. But its most profound lesson was about the human cost of war. Every victory, every defeat, every mission carries with it stories of lives changed forever. As we prepared our planes for the next missions, I carried with me a new perspective. We weren't just pilots carrying out orders, we were guardians of a greater responsibility to protect not only our country, but also the values we were fighting for. In the days following the Battle of Midway, our routine on the Enterprise took on a new rhythm. The initial euphoria of victory gave way to renewed determination. Each of us knew that despite the devastating blow we had struck against the Japanese Navy, the war was far from over. Morrison, still recovering, went on to assist in the Operations Center, analyzing reconnaissance reports. His experience as a navigator provided valuable insights into the movement patterns of the remaining Japanese forces. The patterns have changed, Bill, he told me during one of our meetings. They're more cautious now, more defensive. A week after the main battle, I received a special mission from Commander Harrison. We needed to do a detailed reconnaissance of the area where the Japanese aircraft carriers had sunk. Intelligence suggested that enemy submarines were still operating in the area, trying to recover sensitive documents and equipment. We took off at dawn with Hayes again as my navigator. The atmosphere was different from the days of intense combat. The ocean, once the scene of a fierce battle, now seemed surprisingly serene. Oil stains still marked the surface like dark scars on the blue water. During the flight, Hayes broke the silence. "You know, Turner, my brother serves in the Merchant Navy. He told me that before the war, these same seas were peaceful trade routes. It's hard to imagine how everything changed so quickly." His remark made me think about how war changes not only people, but also places. We spotted something interesting during our patrol. A Japanese submarine had surfaced briefly, probably to recharge its batteries. Our order was to observe and report, not engage. It was a difficult decision, but strategically correct. Sometimes information is worth more than an impulsive attack. Back on the Enterprise, I took part in a meeting with other veteran pilots. We discussed the lessons learned at Midway. Our tactic of coordinated attacks had proved devastatingly effective, but we also identified areas for improvement. Communication between squadrons, for example, needed to be improved. One of the most impressive stories to emerge from those days was that of Torpedo Squadron 8. Of 15 planes that took off to attack the Japanese aircraft carriers, only one returned. Their sacrifice, though apparently in vain, had forced the Japanese fighters to drop altitude, leaving them vulnerable to our dive bombers. Morrison was finally given a full medical discharge and returned to active service. Our first mission together after his recovery was a routine patrol flight, but for us it had a special meaning. Just like old times Bill, he said, adjusting his equipment with that comforting familiarity. During that flight, we spotted something that put us on alert: the wreckage of a previously unrecorded American plane. After marking the position, we began a search pattern for survivors. We didn't find anyone, but we did recover a bag containing documents that would prove valuable for intelligence purposes. The war taught us to value small victories and to honor every sacrifice. In the Enterprise's mess hall, there was now a mural with photos of the pilots lost at Midway. Among them, Jimmy Watson's jovial smile constantly reminded us of the price of victory. Intelligence reports began to show the true impact of Midway. The loss of the 4 aircraft carriers had forced Japan into a defensive posture. Its naval operations had become more cautious, more limited. The balance of power in the Pacific had definitely changed. One afternoon, while carrying out maintenance on my Dauntless, I found bullet marks that I hadn't noticed before. Each mark told a story, a moment of extreme danger that by some miracle or skill we had survived. I ran my hand over those metallic scars, grateful for each mission completed. The flight routine was still intense, but now was different. We were no longer reacting to an immediate threat, but consolidating our position and protecting our achievements. Every takeoff, every landing was executed with the precision that only experience provides. Evenings on the Enterprise took on a new ritual. Veteran pilots shared their experiences with the rookies, not just combat tactics, but survival lessons, tricks learned the hard way. It was our way of honoring those who didn't return, ensuring that their sacrifice continued to save lives. The weeks following Midway brought profound changes not only in the war, but in each one of us. The Enterprise continued its operations in the Pacific, but there was something different in the air. Our victory had proved that the enemy was not invincible, but it had also taught us the true weight of responsibility. During a reconnaissance flight with Morrison, now fully recovered, we reflected on how our lives had changed since those decisive days. "You know, Bill," he commented, adjusting his instruments, "before Midway, we were just pilots following orders. Now we're part of history." Commander Harrison had implemented new combat tactics based on our experiences. Our coordinated attacks at Midway became a model for other units to study. Young pilots arrived at Enterprise eager to learn from those who had taken part in the battle. One afternoon, while instructing a group of rookies on diving techniques, one of them asked me about fear. "Fear never goes away," I replied, "but you learn to turn it into focus." At Midway, every dive was a dance with death, but our determination was greater than our fear. Morrison and I were assigned to a special reconnaissance mission near Wake Island. Intelligence indicated Japanese movement in the area, possibly an attempt to establish a new defensive line. The flight would be long and dangerous, but we were the natural choice because of our experience. During the flight, we encountered adverse weather conditions. Low cloud and rain made visibility difficult, but years of partnership allowed us to operate almost by instinct. Morrison kept our navigation precise, even in the worst conditions, a skill that had saved us countless times. We spotted a Japanese convoy trying to regroup. They were mainly transport ships, escorted by destroyers. We kept our distance, photographing and recording their positions. This was not an attack mission, but every piece of information we collected could be crucial for future operations. Back on the Enterprise, our discoveries generated intense activity in the command center. The Japanese were clearly trying to establish new supply routes, adapting to the loss of their main aircraft carriers. Our victory at Midway had forced a complete reorganization of their naval strategy. During a briefing session, Commander Harrison presented detailed analyses of enemy movement patterns. "Gentlemen," he said, What we did at Midway was not just destroy ships. We fundamentally changed how this war will be fought in the Pacific. The stories of Midway began to circulate among the other units of the fleet. Pilots from other aircraft carriers sought us out to hear firsthand how we had carried out those precise attacks. Morrison joked that we had become involuntary professors of military history. One evening I came across a letter of thanks from Jimmy Watson's family. Their simple words about how their son's sacrifice had contributed to something greater moved me deeply. I kept that letter as a constant reminder of the human cost of our victory. Operations continued to be intense. Each mission demanded the same precision and courage that we had shown at Midway. The difference was that we now carried not only the responsibility of our missions, but also the legacy of those historic June days. Morrison developed his own training system for new sailors, incorporating lessons learned during the battle. The difference between coming home or not, he explained, can be in the smallest details. Every calculation, every observation counts. The Enterprise became more than an aircraft carrier. It was a living symbol of our resilience and determination. Her battle scars like ours told stories of courage and sacrifice. Every takeoff from her deck carried the weight of that heritage. As we prepared for new missions, I realized that Midway had transformed us, not just as soldiers, but as men. We learned the value of precision, calculated courage, and above all, the importance of trusting each other when everything else seemed uncertain. 78 years have passed since Midway, and I still wake up some nights remembering those decisive moments. As the only survivor still alive from my original unit, I feel a responsibility to keep alive the memory of those days that changed the course of history. Morrison passed away 15 years ago, but his last words still echo in my mind. "Bill, tell our story. Don't let them forget." And that's exactly what I've been doing, sharing not only the moments of glory, but also the harsh realities we faced. After Midway, our unit continued operating for another 3 years. Each mission carried the weight of that historic victory, and we were often called upon to share our experiences with new squadrons. The Enterprise became a kind of floating academy where veterans like me passed on vital knowledge to the next generation of pilots. One of the most important lessons I always emphasized was about teamwork. At Midway, it wasn't one exceptional pilot or a single heroic action that ensured our victory. It was the perfect coordination between different units, the mutual trust between pilot and navigator, the precise synchronization of each attack. I remember one particular mission weeks after Midway when we were escorting a supply convoy. A young pilot, nervous on his first real mission, asked me how we kept calm during attacks. "Calm comes from confidence." I replied, "Confidence in your training and your team, and in the certainty that everyone will do their part." The impact of Midway went far beyond the destruction of the Japanese aircraft carriers. We fundamentally changed the way naval warfare would be conducted. Our tactics of coordinated attacks became standard doctrine, studied and replicated throughout the American fleet. The losses we suffered at Midway have never been forgotten. I kept in touch with the families of several lost pilots, including Jimmy Watson's mother. Years later, she sent me a photo of him as a child dreaming of becoming a pilot. That photo remained in my cabin throughout the war, a constant reminder of the human cost of our victory. Morrison developed a training system that became a benchmark in the Navy. The difference between success and failure is in the details, he always told new sailors. His meticulous method of navigation and coordination saved countless lives in the years that followed. The Enterprise remained our home until the end of the war. That aircraft carrier carried not only aircraft and crew, but also the memories and spirit of Midway. Every mark on her deck, every scar on her structure, told a story of courage and determination. When the war finally ended, I found that returning to civilian life was a different challenge. How do you readapt to normality after having taken part in such a crucial moment in history? The answer, I discovered, lay in keeping the memory of those days alive, not to glorify the war, but to teach its lessons to future generations. In the years that followed, I dedicated myself to documenting our experiences. Every detail, every maneuver, every decision made during those crucial days was recorded. Not just the technical aspects of the operations, but also the emotions, fears, and hopes we shared. Midway's legacy goes beyond military victory. We demonstrated that even in the face of seemingly impossible odds, the combination of preparation, courage, and teamwork can overcome any obstacle. This is the lesson I try to pass on to young people today, not about the glory of war, but about the power of human determination. Now at 98, when I look back, I see Midway not just as a battle, but as a moment that defined an entire generation. Every man who took part in those events carried a part of that experience with him for the rest of his life. The story of Midway remains relevant today, not just as a study of military tactics, but as a testament to the human spirit. It shows how ordinary people, when united by a greater purpose, can accomplish extraordinary feats. Morrison used to say that our real victory at Midway was not to sink the Japanese aircraft carriers, but to prove that determination and teamwork can overcome any adversity. He was right. That's the real legacy we leave for future generations. As I share these memories, my thoughts are with those who didn't return: Jimmy Watson, so many other young people whose dreams and potential were cut short prematurely. Their stories are an inseparable part of Midway's history, and my duty is to ensure that they are never forgotten. The war taught us a lot about courage, sacrifice, and the importance of camaraderie. But perhaps its most valuable lesson is about the responsibility we have towards the memory of those who are gone. Every time I tell this story, I honor not only our victory, but also the sacrifice of everyone who made it possible.